All right, Happy New Year, everyone. I'm here back after the holidays, after a short break with the Anbernic RG34XX for you here today. I know I'm a little late to the party on this one, but you know, it's been a busy time of year, so I finally had the time to check this out and get some thoughts and opinions on it. So today we're going to do a review on the 34XX and my thoughts on this and whether it's something that you might consider buying or not. So let's get started. So the box contains all the standard fare. Got our little protective coverings, our bags. Let's just go ahead and drop the console, why not? Comes with this cute little lanyard thing that goes into a hole on it. We got our screen protector as usual, and the guarantee inside this box is a USB cable, but we've all seen the USB cable before, so let's go ahead and move on. So I'm just gonna give you a little backstory on myself personally. I'm the right age to have enjoyed the Game Boy Advance, but personally I didn't have one. I had the Game Boy DMG growing up, and my parents just never got around to buying me the Color or the Game Boy Advance. But I had a cousin of similar age who did have this exact looking Game Boy Advance, the purple indigo color. So there's definitely a little bit of nostalgia for me, but there's not as many nostalgia points awarded to this one for me as maybe some other YouTube reviewers, because I did not own this one. So while going through the review today, keep that in mind that I don't have too heavily tinted rose-colored glasses on this one. I do recognize the cool appeal of it looking like the original Nintendo hardware, but I also am not necessarily giving it a lot of bonus points for that look, so let's talk about that. And a quick disclaimer, this unit was sent to me by MechDIY. I really appreciate the folks over there giving me the opportunity to review this unit. They didn't pay me, but they did send me consideration in form of this review unit, of course. Now, that's not going to affect my opinion. They have no say in what happens in this review or whether I like or dislike the console. So either way, if you're interested in picking one up, check out the links in the description for any coupon codes or links to pick one of these up from MechDIY or elsewhere if that's something that you're interested in. All right, so I'm not going to jump into the specs in detail on this one. This is the same H7 chipset you know and love or hate from Anbernic. I think we've seen 12 of these last year in just as many months, so we already know what this can do. It's got decent performance for what it sets out to do. It's not going to play a ton of joystick-based 3D games, but there's no joystick anyways, so it's not really a big deal. It does come in a few cool colors. Of course, we've got the classic indigo purple color that you see here on the Game Boy Advance, GameCube, famous for all of those Nintendo consoles and handhelds. It also comes in a relatively plain looking black, a transparent red, and transparent green, which both look super awesome from the pictures I've seen. But I'm kind of glad that I got sent this indigo one, because it really is that true, authentic color from at least what I remember from my childhood, from my cousin owning this. I borrowed his Game Boy Advance and copy of Golden Sun, so there's a little bit of nostalgia there. As far as the price goes, it's about what we've seen for other handhelds of this style. It's roughly $70 before any shipping or taxes, depending on where you pick it up. At MechDIY, it does start at $86, but there's a coupon code right now for new users, 15% off, which makes it $73, so only a couple bucks more than from Anbernic Direct. And MechDIY did ship this one pretty fast to me, so you may get it sooner if you order it from there. But something interesting I noticed is if you order it from MechDIY and you get the bundled SD card and you use the coupon code, that actually makes it slightly cheaper than on Anbernic's. I think it was like $86 on MechDIY with the 64 gig card, and it's like 89 or something like that on Anbernic. I'll throw that up on the screen. But yeah, so that's definitely a great way to pick this handheld up. I'll leave, again, some links down in the description if you're interested in supporting this channel and using those affiliate links. I do earn a tiny bit of commission, but that helps me produce these videos for you. So without further ado, let's take a tour of the device, and we'll start here at the top. You'll notice that we have our traditional bumpers, but there's also these sort of clever L2 and R2 bumpers that are inset a little bit and behind. So, you know, most systems you're gonna play on this probably don't even need those, maybe more useful as hotkeys, but they're still there when you need them without being in the way. We've got a reset button, our OTG and charging USB-C port, a mini HDMI port for video out, and then our traditional 2 SD card layout that you see on the H700 chipset devices. On the bottom here, we've got our power button, our headphone jack, and a volume wheel, and this is another cool little throwback to have this kind of analog-esque volume wheel. It's not truly analog that it infinitely rolls, it's more of like kind of a joystick that springs in either direction, but it still definitely pays some homage to that classic styling on the handhelds we grew up with, so kind of a cool, nice little touch there. On the sides, there's nothing to speak of really, but we do have these gray accent pieces that kind of just set off that original authentic vibe, and of course we've got our little attachment there for a little lanyard that they include, so kind of a clever little thing. On the back, there's not much to speak of, just got the screw cover for the battery in there, as well as some other screws to disassemble it. We kind of already mentioned the bumpers in the top of the device here. And of course on the front, you've got all the standard stuff, but I did want to shout out a couple things. One thing that I think is super cool they did here is the X and Y buttons are slightly smaller, unlabeled, and in all of the devices, they match the color of the shell. And especially on the indigo and black models, they really blend in. So it's kind of cool to see that very traditional Game Boy style. You still get the added convenience of these buttons for when you want to play the console systems like Super Nintendo that have the ABXY, but they don't visually distract as much. We've got our classic little mono speaker on the bottom here, and then start and select, not my favorite location, but it's classic and exactly what is on the Game Boy Advance, so I think it's totally appropriate. And then our kind of small D-pad, and we'll get into that in just a moment here. As far as the overall finish and feel, I mean, what can I say other than it looks like a Game Boy Advance? However, I will say that the plastics on this are pretty decent, but they feel just a little bit cheaper than some of the Anbernics. And let me pull a couple out just so you've got an idea of what I'm talking about. So out of the lot here, we've got the Cube, which has, I think, a little bit more solid feeling plastic overall. The 35XX, which has a little bit of grit and that transparency. I would say this is probably the second worst plastic out of the bunch. And then surprisingly, the little 28XX is actually my favorite plastic because it really does have a nice texture and feeling to it. It doesn't feel cheap when you grip on it, you know, ironically that being the smallest one, but yeah, there it is. That's not to say that the plastic here on the 34XX is bad. It's perfectly okay, but it's not like the same grade of plastic that you would see an actual OEM manufacturer use maybe. And you know, I'm kind of nitpicking here, but I just want you guys to know all my thoughts about the device. I'm gonna go ahead and bring up the tester here so we can talk about the controls on this device a little bit. And starting with the bumpers, they do have a membrane. They are a nice soft feeling, but they do make just a hair amount of noise. But it's not really clicky or particularly obnoxious. They just hit the shell a little bit there. Triggers are essentially the exact same as the bumpers, actually a little bit quieter. They really do kind of have a nice placement for what they are. So I do think that's really a clever integration of the L2 and R2 on this unit. And as I mentioned before, the start and select location, not necessarily optimal to hit in the middle of the game to pause. I do always like it up here, but it's true to the original, so that's probably the right choice here. As far as any additional function buttons, we do have the mode button on top here, which is used heavily for RetroArch or even just in the default game emulator apps to access the settings menu. It's in a fine location. I will say that if you're doing some RetroArch hotkeys like fast forward where you have to hit this and this at the same time, that's kind of awkward to do, or even save state as these twos at the same time, or quit as here and here. That's a little bit easier. Yeah, and then of course you can do mode plus the volume to change the brightness. I don't think it'll do that here in the controller tester, but yeah, it's a great thing to have. And it's fine for just quickly tapping into the menu, but a little awkward for some of the hotkey combinations. Of course, if you're using the RetroArch option to emulate on here, you could remap your hotkey button to select or something like that for easier access. So getting into the meat of it, we've got the face buttons here. You know that I can be kind of picky about these, and I'll say that I generally like Anbernic's face buttons. They all have a nice membrane feel. It's soft, they're not too loud. These do have a bit of wobble, which again, is kind of a hallmark Anbernic thing. Nice travel and nice button feel, but a little wobbly. They are a little bit on the tall side, but still relatively comfortable to use. And as I mentioned, the X and Y are smaller, but still not any problem there. So, you know, the face buttons, absolutely not something that I have any problems with here. They are solid. The D-pad, however, is probably one of my biggest nitpicks here. And maybe again, this is just, it's true to the original, so that is what it is. But I just feel that it is too small, a little bit too sensitive, and borderline uncomfortable. I was playing some Sonic last night where I was constantly holding down in a direction to run, and that meant that this little corner, you know, right here on the D-pad was kind of digging into my thumb and got a little uncomfortable for an extended session. So I will say the D-pad is a little bit compromised for extended sessions if you're playing a game where you're constantly having to do inputs on the D-pad. If you're playing a JRPG or something like that, where you're just occasionally moving around, navigating the menus, that's probably not as much of a bother, but a more action-oriented game or platformer, it's a little less comfortable. And as far as the diagonals, it's really easy to hit the diagonals, just a slight wobble here. And so I predict that in terms of accuracy, it's not gonna be the best. As you can see here, I'm pressing left, but but if I don't perfectly center it, I'm getting a diagonal. So for accurate platformers, that may be a little bit of an issue. Of course, usually the inverse relationship there is that if it's kind of bad for platformers and accuracy, it might be better for rolling and easy to roll around and hit all the points. And that's certainly the case here. Although again, those corners kind of dig into your thumb when you're rolling. You know, I'm nitpicking a little bit here, but I will say the D-pad is probably the worst part about the controls on here, which for a handheld that's dedicated to D-pad gaming, that's a little bit of a miss. Again, that may be just because they're trying to go authentic to the original, but I would have preferred probably if they had just made these little cross pieces a little bit wider and a little bit softer on the fingers. I think that would have been a better experience, even if it wasn't authentic. So speaking about comfort, we can talk about ergonomics. And you know, I think if you've seen any other reviews on this so far, I think most of us reviewers have generally a similar opinion, which is it's authentic to the original, but the original wasn't perfect either. It can feel a little awkward to hold, especially I think with bigger hands, like kid hands were probably better meant for this. You know, you can hold it down here a little bit more to get to the buttons, but then if you want the triggers, that's awkward. But if you hold it up here with the triggers, I just felt that then now my thumb is too tall and I gotta crook it to get to the D-pad and the buttons. You can hold it a little bit wider out, but I just found that I'm always holding it slightly awkwardly. And it's fine for shorter play sessions. It's not a big deal at all. But again, if you want something that you're going to play for hours, there might be some better form factors. Something like the Cube XX is definitely a much more comfortable device with the grips on the back here for a long session and has a much more comfortable D-pad for rolling around. So I think that's all going to factor into what my ultimate conclusion is going to be on this device, which is it's really good for certain things, but not for all things. As far as size comparisons go, I'm not going to spend a ton of time here because, well, it's a Game Boy Advance for all intents and purposes. As far as size, I personally don't have one, but I think some other reviewers who do put them side by side and they're like nearly identical to fractions of the millimeter. But just so you have an idea, here's the SP when its folded state is about the same height as the 34XX here, but not as wide. But of course, opened up, it is bigger. And yeah, I did drop my SP. That was a sad day. Of course, the Cube, as you just saw a moment ago, is significantly larger, but again, that comes with more comfort. I mean, when I say significantly, it's only slightly wider and slightly taller, but it's not as rounded here. But the big difference is, of course, the profile and the grips and how much more meat is back there. But these are some of the best bumpers, triggers, and buttons Anbernic has on a budget handheld, in my opinion. Some people prefer the SP for its tactile clickiness, but I prefer the more old school membrane style, so the Cube is definitely more comfortable for its size. Sticking with the trend of Anbernic H700 devices, here's the 28XX. So if you want something that's more of a pocket-friendly device, of course, this is probably the one to get, and it's smaller. It does have smaller buttons, but they have a little bit less travel, so I think they're still pretty comfortable. But this D-pad is similarly to this one in its feel. In fact, it's even a little bit more tall and raised, so I think this one could be more uncomfortable. You know, in my original review of this unit, I talked a lot of good about it, but I think in retrospect that I maybe should have given it a little bit more flack for the D-pad on here. And one last one I wanted to throw in here because it's my current favorite pocket handheld is the Trim UI brick. As you can see here, it is a similar size, but not as tall, and sort of similar, but slightly slimmer and as well for thickness. Now the screen is a little bit smaller, but for 4:3 content, because this is a 3:2 screen, they're actually going to be pretty similar in the displayed area, but of course Game Boy Advance is going to be bigger on here. Trim UI does have a nice high resolution display though, so stuff looks a little bit crisper in the details. So if you're going for truly a pocket handheld, then the brick is one of my top recommendations right now for a general purpose small handheld. And since I just mentioned the screen, and I realized I forgot to mention that earlier when covering the specs, or rather kind of blowing through that since this is the 7 millionth H700, we have a 720 by 480 screen, which translates to a 3:2 aspect ratio, which means, of course, you're going to get perfect integer scaling for your Game Boy Advance games. So that really kind of ties into what this review is going to be all about, which is you should buy this if you're obsessed with Game Boy Advance and you just want to play Game Boy Advance on it. Then yes, it's probably the best H700 for Game Boy Advance. It's authentic, but it's not the best H700 for 4:3 content because of that screen aspect ratio. Now there is something a little weird going on with the screen on this one, so I wanted to pull that up real quick in RetroArch so I can show you. Okay, so we're just gonna go into the output settings in RetroArch here, and you can see this estimated screen refresh rate here is climbing. The system is reporting this 59.156 refresh rate, but you see here that we're at what, 106 now, and I think oftentimes it climbs up to about 110 hertz. Oh, there, it just bumped up. So it's a weird performance. So I guess this display is actually a more than 60 hertz display. So that may represent itself some weird ways in games in terms of frame pacing. Now, because it's higher than 60, almost double, the frame pacing issues are probably going to be fairly slight, but if you're sensitive to the motion in the games, you might notice that. Now, our friendly neighborhood developer Gamma has released a package that I think you can flash for like the boot firmware that'll knock it up to 120 hertz to get that perfect multiple. It's unknown, I think, that if Anbernic is going to fix this in a firmware update or not. Maybe they've said something since this originally came out, but so far I haven't seen anything. And I imagine most of the custom firmwares are eventually going to adopt fixes to change that screen refresh rate, but it is just a little weird thing to mention about the screen on here. Really quick, I'm going to take the default shaders off on here. It does have a grid shader by default, just so I can compare this screen to a couple other devices with a neutral comparison point. So one thing you may initially notice at this comparison here is that the 34XX is possibly the dimmest of the lot. This SP, it might actually be close in brightness, but you can see here that the Trim UI brick is significantly brighter on the display. So that's one of the first criticisms about this screen I have, maybe, is that it could be brighter. It's totally fine for indoor use and you don't want to blast your eyeballs out anywhere, but I think that you would suffer to use this in a bright outdoor condition. Even on an overcast day, it can get pretty bright, so you may struggle a little bit to see the screen on this one. And then the second piece I have about the screen is the viewing angle. Now, of course, most of the time you're just gonna be looking straight on your handheld, so it's probably not the biggest deal in the world, but if you tilt it slightly, notice how much darker it gets. And it actually gets lighter right at the very end there, but of course you're never gonna look at it from that angle. But I do occasionally have it at a slight tilt when I'm playing it, and you do see a brightness loss there. Now let's compare that to the brick here, and yeah, there's a little bit of a brightness loss there too, but since the peak brightness is higher, it's not of a big of a deal. Normally this is something that I don't really focus on a whole lot, but I think even compared to the SP, it is worse. It gets dimmer when you tilt it. I don't know if that's something on other handhelds that I just haven't noticed, but it was one of the first things when I opened the box and sat down to play with this. I had it at a slight angle and not turned up all the way, and I was like, man, this is kind of dim. So just something to keep an eye out for. As far as colors, I think it looks pretty good. The brick here is one of the best small handheld displays, so it's a little unfair to show it against here, but I mean, they are in the same price bracket. So if you want a small pocket handheld, this does have a better screen on it in general, as long as you're okay with losing that little bit of screen real estate. So for now, let's remove the brick and focus a little bit more on the aspect ratios of the screen. Again, apologize for the fact that I cracked my SP. Again, I shed a few tears that day, but alas, we can still use it for comparisons here. For 3.2 content, for Gameboy Advance content, you can see that the 34XX is a little bigger, but not really. The main difference is just that you don't have the additional bezel area down here, that it's just more straight across. I did turn off the overlay because it had the grid filter, but there's a good chunk at the bottom here on the SP that is just black. So I think the more important comparison here is, what does the 4.3 content look like? And I think you're getting still like 3.2 inches on here, so it's not like a huge trade-off, but again, not optimal for that size. So let's take a look. And again, let me turn off the bezels and all those extra things. So here you can see that the 4.3 content is a decent size larger on the SP here. So if you are planning on playing mostly not Game Boy Advance, then this doesn't really make quite as much sense. In the SP, 35XXH, the 35XX Plus, or if you want to step up in size, the Cube, the 40XXV are all better options for 4.3 content, in my opinion, unless you really love the nostalgia. But of course, this nails the whole Game Boy Advance thing. So I guess this is sort of a situation of, well, what did you expect? It plays Game Boy Advance games amazingly, and it has the perfect aspect ratio for it. There's a little bit of brightness issue at angles and a weird refresh rate thing. To be honest, I don't really notice the refresh rate thing during gameplay, but I did want to call that out there because it is slightly off. And yeah, the screen looks great from straight on in an indoor environment, but outdoors or at an angle, it does suffer a little bit. And if you use things like the pixel shaders, that also diminishes the brightness a little bit, unfortunately, because you're adding those black lines to the image. So if you use heavy shaders, that's also something to consider. That extra screen brightness is always helpful there. As far as what systems it emulates up to without issue, well, all the ones that you'd want to play on it. Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast is still kind of the upper limit of this chip, Dreamcast being even more of a stretch than Nintendo 64, but with the absence of a joystick on the handheld, generally those aren't going to be great experiences for most games. So really, we're going to play Game Boy Advance, we're going to play PlayStation 1, and then we're going to play all the systems older than those, and they're going to be just fine on this chipset, as long as you don't try to delve into heavy shaders. I did try to use some fancier Game Boy pixel shaders on here, and the performance did start to struggle a little bit, which is the limits of the chipset, but simple scanline and grid shaders work without any issues. Now that we've covered a little bit of the screen and the games that we can run on it, let's take a quick listen to the audio. Again, there's that cool little volume thing here. So, I would actually say I kind of like the audio. Of course, there's no bass, it's a little handheld speaker. It's mono, it's not stereo, but it's period correct. It is not harsh, it's not overly tinny, it's not overly mid-rangey. It gets the job done, and the retro stuff kind of sounds decent through it. So for what it sets out to do, I think the speaker is perfectly adequate in here. So let's jump into a little bit about the software. You briefly saw me navigate menus a few times during the video, but let's look at that a little bit closer. So when you first boot up the console, you're met with this screen here, and you've got these game rooms and then RA game. They sort of functionally do similar things, except for the game rooms are a very simple interface. So if we jump into a game here and we pull that up, let's let it boot up. And then when you go into the menu on this, you get this very simplified UI. So it's sort of a choose your difficulty thing. If you just want something that's basic, you can save the game, load it, exit it, and then you've got fast, which is just, plain linear scaling, and then smooth, which is probably like a bilinear scaling, HD, which is like a texture filter. I usually don't like using those. And then we've got a couple scan line options on here. And then on some of the handheld systems, we also get like a dot matrix effect. Depends on which system you're emulating. So yeah, those are there, super easy to use. So that is kind of the easy route. Now, if we quit out of that, and then we head over to the RA game section, it's gonna launch the full RetroArch interface, and I've toggled the simple menu off so that you can get the full menu, and it's probably where I would spend most of my time, but again, this just depends on you and what you want to be able to accomplish with the system. So here we can just pick up, and then once we're in game, we tap that same mode button, and now we get the full RetroArch menu. So if you want to fiddle around with custom shaders, custom bezels, tweaking the cores, changing VSync, all those kinds of things, then this is where you're going to want to live. And this also has more standard RetroArch hotkeys that you're used to. So if I'm in the game, I can do, my keys here, and I mentioned this is an awkward combo, but we've got our fast forward, we've got our save state, and we've got those standard RetroArch hotkeys if you're used to using that system. So that's where I prefer to live, because you do get a little bit more user control, but again, you've got the more simplified UI. And honestly, I think that the stock firmware on this one is fine. I don't think this is a unit where you have to rescue it with custom firmware. You've probably seen handhelds before where it's like difficult, overly complicated, not the best experience out of the box, but honestly, this one does what it sets out to do, and it does it just fine, and it looks fine. So there's really no need to put custom firmware on here if you just want to boot it up, play some games, and throw some filters on. But of course, if you want to do custom firmware, we do have a lot of options, and since this uses the H700 chipset, one of the advantages of the fact that Anbernic has put out so many of these is that there's already a lot of active custom firmware development. This isn't necessarily an exhaustive list, but 3 of the top options that are out there right now. We do have MinUI, which is one of my personal favorites because it just gives you a very simplified analog pocket inspired menu that is straight to the point with no fluff, as Mr. Sujano would say, all stuff and no fluff. But we also get Noli, which is based on more of a Batocera type image, which gives you that emulation station Batocera interface that you may be familiar with a lot of older Linux handhelds, although it can be a bit more bogged down because it's got more going on under the hood there. And then there is MuOS, which is more bare bones and it's straightforward. It's easier to put games onto the card with MuOS. Noli kind of needs maybe some knowledge of SFTP or Linux file systems or something like that to get games on it, whereas MuOS, you just pop it in your computer, load the games in a folder. You don't even have to follow a specific naming convention. Just pick the folder in MuOS, boot it up, and then bam, it works. So it's definitely a bit more simple while still giving you a little bit more control maybe than the stock OS on here. So all three of those are great options. Then I did forget to mention that I think Noli is still in pre-alpha, so that is behind a paid, I think, Ko-fi, whatever you want to call it, membership right now. But I do believe that MIUI and MuOS both have publicly available builds right now for this device. But again, stock OS, it's just fine. This is one of the first Anbernics where I maybe just leave the stock OS on it. I don't know if I care enough to swap it out for custom firmware, and I think that says a lot because I like to tinker, so I think it does a solid job of what it sets out to do. As far as heat and temperature goes on this device, I didn't notice anything. To be honest, I didn't play hours and hours on this, partly because of the comfort thing, but I think because we've got this thicker shell and there's some void area in there, I don't think feeling heat on this is ever really going to be an issue like on some other handhelds. So that's really it. That's what I have to say about the 34XX today. So what do you guys think? Do you think that this is a handheld that you should only buy for Game Boy Advance and nothing else? You could totally do that, load it up with your Game Boy Advance collection and nothing else, and just be happy and pretend that, the year is like 2003 again, you're on summer break, you're playing Golden Sun on your Game Boy Advance, and you're just happy. You can totally do that, and that's probably one of the best ways to experience this device. As a general purpose for multiple systems, the aspect ratio is a little bit more of a poor fit. I'd say that the SP, the 35XX Plus, a MIUI Mini Plus, the TrimUI Brick, those all might be better options for a general pocket PAL that plays a lot of different systems, but none of those quite have the nostalgia factor as this. Well, the 35XX SP does, but to me, this Game Boy Advance is the iconic Game Boy Advance and not the SP. But that's really going to depend on your age and what you grew up with, which one of those kind of speaks to you more. I just think that this one has a little bit more of a unique and iconic look to it as far as not being, a clamshell or something like that. As I mentioned earlier, if you want something a little bit bigger and more ergonomic for long play sessions without breaking the bank, we've got the Cube XX here, which is going to be a very similar experience as far as the software and all that stuff, but we've got joysticks also and a bit better buttons, more comfortable in the hand, but it's less likely to slide into a pocket and go with you somewhere. And also I don't have it in hand anymore, but the 40XXV gives you a 4-inch 4:3 screen. So if you want a vertical and the big screen, then that may be a better option. But if you want a horizontal and you don't want the 35XXH, and you don't want the 40XXH, which gets a little warm from what I've heard, and you want the nostalgia factor, then this is probably the one to get. I don't think this is a console that I can say, yeah, you need to go out and buy this if you want a new retro gaming console. If you already own another Anbernic H700 and it does the job, there's little to no reason to buy this, unless you want the Game Boy Advance nostalgia, which is a perfectly fine reason. I'm not shaming anybody that goes out and gets this just for Game Boy Advance. Even if I don't play this one, I might keep it just to put it on my shelf because it looks so cool and looks a lot like the original hardware, but I probably won't use this as one of my daily drivers. I don't think it's enough to replace the TrimUI Brick in my pocket right now. So, am I crazy for not being absolutely in love with the 34XX, or do you think I'm right on the money and this is a cool niche handheld but not for everyone? Let me know in the comments if you agree. Let me know in the comments if you disagree. Tell me what your favorite pocket handheld is and why this is or isn't it. All that being said, again, as always, I'm a new channel. I'm only around for a couple months doing this YouTube thing, so every like, comment, and subscribe really helps me out. If you're interested in picking one of these up, check out the MechDIY affiliate links in the description to help my channel out. If you don't want to give me money through the affiliate links, then still go buy it if you like it. I'm not telling you to do one thing or other, but I do really appreciate it if you help me out. And you know what? That's it for today. Next week, I'm going to be at CES seeing a lot of cool new stuff, but I probably won't have any long form videos out for a couple weeks while I chew through all that content. So take a look at this. I think I may be getting a MIUI Flip sometime in the next month or so if that ever shows up. So we'll take a look at that hotly awaited handheld. But for now, everybody, I hope you're enjoying your new year. Stay safe out there. I hope you had a happy holidays. And that's it for today. Thank you.